Right, I think we better start. I'm going to go through the formalities of introducing our next speaker. Now, Dr. Leon Goldman has recently, I don't know how recently actually, I think a couple of years, 3 years, had his doctoral thesis accepted at SOAS, and he's now postdoctoral fellow there. He came to us from Australia with a degree, an undergraduate degree, and he came to England with a background in Indian languages, and especially religions of India and also Sanskrit, which invariably you're going to come across if you're doing religions of India. But at SOAS, he turned his interest towards Zoroastrianism as well, and has mastered the not easy language of Avestan, which, from my own experience, takes quite a lot of getting to grips with. So he has now been using his Avestan and Sanskrit to do a comparative study, and his original thesis work was on the Rashnias, which was purely, the Rashnias was on purely Zoroastrian Avestan scripts, but now he's using his Sanskrit and his Avestan to do a comparative study looking at the translation into Sanskrit of the Yasna liturgy. And it's attributed to a Parsi priest. Now, I was under the impression the Parsi priest was from about the 14th or 15th century, but it might be a little earlier. So we'll hear a little bit more about that from Leon. And he's going to basically look at, I'm not quite sure what approach he's going to take. So in fact, I am looking forward enormously to finding out what comparisons he's going to make and what points he'll be drawing out. I'm sure it'll be extremely interesting. And of course, as before, there will be questions that you'll be privileged to put to him once we've heard his talk. So thank you very much, Leon, for coming.
Well, a very good morning to you all, and thank you very much, firstly, to the organisers for having invited me to come and speak at this year's symposium. I've attended quite a few of these in the past, and so I can say it's a real privilege and an honour to have been given the opportunity to speak today. And the topic that I decided to say a few words about is I would say a lesser studied chapter in the religious writings of the Zoroastrians, and that is the Parsi Sanskrit tradition. That's to say, the body of texts belonging to the Zoroastrian tradition composed in Sanskrit. Let me begin just by giving a very brief overview of the Zoroastrian text corpora, so the bodies of Zoroastrian texts according to the language in which they were composed and the time period as well. So, as I'm sure all of you are aware, the oldest layer of Zoroastrian texts, the oldest compositions, are those composed in the ancient language of Avesten. The very oldest portions of the Avesta, namely the Gathas and the Yasnahaptanghaiti, were perhaps composed as far back as the early 2nd millennium BCE, the remainder being composed during the 1st millennium BCE. And the Avesta comprises, on the one hand, these texts of the long liturgy, so the Yasna, the Videvdad, and the Visperad. We also have a collection of 21 yashts, so these hymns devoted to different members of the Zoroastrian pantheon, as well then a collection of texts which are collectively known as the Hodea Avesta. Initially, these texts were passed on orally, and it perhaps wasn't until the 1st millennium CE, during the Sasanian era, that these texts were then first committed to writing. And it's from the Sasanian era that, in fact, most of these compositions composed in the Pahlavi, the Middle Persian language, derive. And the Pahlavi texts consist, on the one hand, of translations, commentaries, exegeses upon existing Avestan language texts. So we have translations in Pahlavi, for example, of the Yasna, of the Videvdad, etc. But we also have a whole range of works devoted to, for example, legal topics, to eschatology, to apocalyptic texts, for example. And these were composed during the first millennium CE, and most of them achieved their finally redacted forms by around the 9th century. Coming after the Pahlavi texts, we then have this body of literature composed in the Sanskrit language. And these texts can really be divided into three broad groups. The first group are those Sanskrit texts which have both Pahlavi antecedents as well as Avesten antecedents. So, for example, we have an incomplete translation into Sanskrit of the Yasna. We also have some fragments in Sanskrit of the Videvdad, and we have quite a number of Sanskrit translations of Avesta texts. The second group of Sanskrit texts that we have are those which are translations of Pahlavi works for which we don't then also have a previous Avesten language version. And so we have, for example, Sanskrit translations of the Book of Righteous Viras, the Arda Viras Namag, the Ishkan Kumanik Vizar, etc., etc. And then we have a third group, which is comparatively small, and this consists of Sanskrit compositions which appear to be original. So they're not translations of pre-existing Pahlavi or Avesten text, but they seem to be original compositions. And one of them is the so-called 16 shlokas, the Shodasha Shloka. And to this group, we might then also include the Sanskrit language colophons that we find in a number of manuscripts. A colophon is just usually quite a short little paragraph, normally placed at the beginning or the end of a manuscript, and it tells us this manuscript was copied by such and such a person on such and such a date for a particular purpose. You'll notice, though, that I haven't indicated a date for the composition of these Sanskrit texts, and that's because this is something of a contentious issue. It's quite difficult to pin down or specify a time frame in which these Sanskrit translations were made. But nonetheless, I think it's quite an interesting question, and so I'd like to begin now by considering it in some depth. One piece of information that we have about these Sanskrit translations is found in a colophon, which we find copied into many Sanskrit Yasna manuscripts. Here is a manuscript we call KM7. Here is the colophon, and it translates something like this. This manuscript of the Zand, that's to say of the translation and commentary exegesis of the Yasna, was translated into the Sanskrit language from the Pahlavi by me, Neryosangh, son of Dhaval. Straight away then, we're given a name, Neryosangh Dhaval, to whom this translation is attributed. What do we know about Neryosangh Dhaval? Well, scholars and commentators have varied in their estimates of when Neryosangh Dhaval might have lived by some 700 years. I'll just run through a couple of these estimates. So there was a German scholar, Führer, writing in the 1880s, and he suggested that Neryosangh should have lived sometime before the 12th century. And he based this estimate upon the existence of a Sanskrit translation of Avesta, and this particular manuscript, which we call J9, bears the date of Sangvat 1400. It just specifies the century, so that corresponds to mid-1300s to mid-1400s CE. Führer was obviously of the impression that if we have a manuscript dated, let's say, mid-1300s or 1400s, then probably this Sanskrit tradition was existing for at least a couple of hundred years before that. Mills, a very well-known scholar, translated many Zoroastrian texts. He arrived at a date of around 1160 for Neryosangh. But he based his estimate upon the priestly family trees. He looked through these genealogies, you assigned so many years per generation, and he traced them back, finding Neryosangh Dhaval, and he suggested mid-1100s was a plausible date. But Martin Haug, before him, he employed the same methodology. He too was looking at the family trees of priestly families, and based on that, he suggested that Neryosangh should have lived sometime in the 15th century. And these discrepancies in dates really highlights one of the difficulties that we face when trying to reconstruct the history based on these genealogies. And this was summed up very nicely by Ervad Merjirana, who in 1899, he wrote a book on the genealogy of the Navsari Parsi priests. And he drew a comparison between the practice in detailing one's priestly family line, tracing it back to Neryosangh, and what was common apparently among the Morbads even in Merjirana's day, which was if you're writing a book, you would sign it with your name, son of so-and-so, son of so-and-so, tracing back your family history as far as you could, and then winding up ultimately by saying descended from Neryosangh Dhaval, for example. Merjirana was of the opinion that writers did this not because they can necessarily trace their lineage back to Neryosangh Dhaval with any certainty, but that they want to be known as having descended from a very well-known and important character. And so Merjirana, when he was considering the time for Neryosangh, he suggested that these lineages, family trees, was not a useful way of determining that. He adopted a different approach. And in fact, Ervad Merjirana argued for a very much earlier date for Neryosangh, sometime in the early 8th century. And he based this upon the Parsi legend, which states that it was Neryosangh Dhaval who led the Zoroastrians when they arrived from Iran to India, and that it was Neryosangh then who negotiated with the Jadirana, the local ruler, for the Zoroastrians' right to live and stay in Iran. What's interesting about this story, that it was Neryosangh Dhaval who led the Zoroastrians to India, is that we don't find any trace of this in the Qisse-i Sanjam. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this text, written in Persian, dating to 1599, which purports to tell the story of the Zoroastrians' arrival in India. This is all to say, I'm not sure that either of these approaches to dating Neryosangh gives us any firm indication of when he might have lived, or when this tradition of translating Zoroastrian texts into Sanskrit might have begun. So instead, let's focus on the facts of as far as we can establish them. So, the earliest datable examples of Zoroastrians in India using Sanskrit are contained in the colophons to several manuscripts. Notably, the manuscripts NK, L4, whose colophon is in fact lost, but we find it copied into other manuscripts, and the manuscript K5. And here you can see, in fact, the Colophon 2K5. This is written in Sanskrit, and all three of these manuscripts, in fact, which date to 1322, 1323, they were written by a very important priest named Mihraban Kai Khosrow. Mihraban Kai Khosrow was an Iranian priest, and in 1322 he travelled to India. We have some information about Mihraban Kai Khosrow, in fact contained in these colophons that he wrote. And I'll give you here a translation of the colophon from K5, which I just showed you. I'm still working a little bit on this translation because it's a bit difficult, but in essence, it says that in the year 1379, Samvat, so it's corresponding to 1323, the Common Era, on such and such a, it was on a Wednesday, such and such a month, here today in Stambatirtha, that is the old name for Kambat, Kambai, at the time when the Sultan Shri Ghayasaddin was exercising his royal authority, a trader, Chahil, the son of the trader Sangan, belonging to the Persian community, having sent a letter that was written in the greatest terms of respect, as well as some money for its writing, he caused this manuscript, namely the Yasna with its Zand, to be copied on his behalf and for the sake of his own merit by the Acharya, the teacher, Mihraban Kai Khosrow, belonging to the Persian community and come from the land of Iran. It was Chahil Sangan then, who was a wealthy, we presume, merchant or trader, who effectively sponsored Mihraban Kai Khosrow to travel to India from Iran to copy these manuscripts. And presumably, he was invited not just to copy manuscripts, but because of his erudition and learning. So I've talked then about the earliest examples of Parsis using Sanskrit that we can date them. But these were just these little colophons, just to say this manuscript was copied in such and such a place and such a date. What then about the earliest datable manuscripts which contain full Sanskrit translations? The earliest with a certain date is a manuscript H2. This is a Sanskrit Hode Avesta manuscript and dates to 1415, the Common Era. We also have a manuscript K9, which was copied, I mentioned earlier, sometime during Samvat 1400, and I can show you a picture. The manuscript is actually missing at the moment, so we have just this one picture that was reproduced in a book more than 100 years ago. When it comes to the Sanskrit version of the Yasna, the dated manuscripts are not so old, only from the 18th century. This is the oldest. But our two oldest examples of the Sanskrit Yasna, we assume, are the manuscripts J3 and the manuscript S1. Now, they've lost many of their folios, and so if they contained a colophon telling us the date when they were copied, we no longer have them. But nonetheless, we assume that these are the earliest examples. And I'll show you. Here's a picture of the manuscript S1, perhaps one of the oldest Sanskrit Yasnas. And just as an aside, I'll say this is a really, really fascinating manuscript because we can see that there are at least 3 different scribes who are responsible for writing it. And these scribes swap and change the whole way through. It's totally unique. At some point in the manuscript's history, an attempt was made to restore it to prevent any more of these leaves being torn, and someone put sort of tape along the edges Well, in this example, it's not a problem, but on many of the folios, this tape is actually being put in the margin and it covers some of the text. But the good news is that thanks to the generosity of Fezana members in the United States, as well as Columbia University, where the manuscript is currently housed, we've successfully raised, I think, about $11,000 to have this manuscript restored, to have this tape taken off, and that's going on at the moment. And as soon as it's done, it will be photographed, and we hope to make a nice book presentation of this manuscript. But to come back to my point, this manuscript, you can see, you don't need to perhaps be an expert in Avestan paleography, but the writing by this scribe here, we have Avesten, looks rather different to the writing in Avesten down here. So we can see at least two different scribes working on this. And this particular style of Avesten writing is very, very peculiar. It is very similar, however, to the style of writing, the particular handwriting style used in J9 manuscript, which I've talked about already. Here we can compare some of the text. It's not identical, but it would seem to be this style of writing belongs to a tradition in India that predated the arrival of Mihraban Kai Khosrow from Iran. And so this gives further weight to the idea that S1 manuscript may indeed be very old. And so this is all to say that when it comes to trying to assign a date to Neryosangh Dhaval and to the beginning of this Sanskrit tradition by the Parsis in India, we can't with certainty date this before 1300 CE. These are the earliest dates that we have for sure. It may well be that it was going on for some centuries before, but we can't say this with any absolute certainty. So having now spoken a little bit about the date and the time frame for this Zoroastrian Sanskrit tradition, I'd like to now turn to look at the translation itself. So we come back to our Colophon, which I showed you at the beginning, telling us that it was written by Neryosangh Dhaval, but it contains another very interesting piece of information. It specifically says that this Sanskrit translation was made into the Sanskrit language from the Pahlavi. It's telling us this Sanskrit translation is based not on the Avestan language original, but upon the intermediate Pahlavi translation. The Sanskrit Yasna is presented as a translation of a translation of the original. A few general observations about the Sanskrit version. When we're told that the Sanskrit language version of the Yasna, for example, is based on the Pahlavi, this is absolutely correct. Okay? If we compare the Sanskrit and the Pahlavi, they sit very closely together. The translator, or translators, they tended to establish a lexical equivalent between Pahlavi and Sanskrit. So, for example, you take a Pahlavi word, atash, and then they would find an equivalent word in Sanskrit, agni, and they tended to use this translation, this word, pretty invariably. Moreover, when we look at the Pahlavi translations of these Avestan texts, they're not straight translations. They contain a translation of the Avestan text, but they also contain a lot of little commentaries, explanations, exegeses on the Avestan text. And we can see in the Sanskrit version that many of these little explanations and commentaries that we find in the Pahlavi version are then carried over into the Sanskrit version as well, in translation. the result is that the Sanskrit translation can be quite difficult to understand by itself because it has a rather mechanical feel to it. And this, unfortunately, has led many Western scholars to be very dismissive of the Sanskrit tradition. We find repeatedly the claim that the Sanskrit employed is barbaric. And another scholar, Barnett, writing in 1926, he described the relationship of the Sanskrit yasna to the Pahlavi yasna as dullness superimposed on dullness. And I think this is a very unfortunate characterization of the tradition, and it's perhaps one of the reasons why so little attention has been paid to the Parsi Sanskrit tradition. What I would like to show you now, through a few examples, is to look at how does the Sanskrit relate to the Pahlavi version on which it's supposedly based, and also how does it relate to the Avesten language original? Because once you start comparing these three versions, we can see a very sophisticated approach being taken by the Sanskrit translators, relying not just on the Pahlavi, but also keeping one eye on the Avesten. So I'm going to give you three examples of the way in which this is evidenced. The first example contains what we can say are formal parallels, grammatical parallels between the Avesten and the Sanskrit language. Avestan and Sanskrit are very closely related. They're often described as sister languages. And if you want to translate an Avestan text, I think you can do no better than to translate it into Sanskrit. Here's an Avestan, a passage from Yasna 30 verse 6. If we look at the Avestan first, we find a verb, upajasat. It means he arrived. If we look at the corresponding passage in the Pahlavi version, we see a change in grammatical number. It is no longer he arrived, but we find the corresponding construction meaning they arrived. We've gone from singular to plural. But if we now look at the Sanskrit version, again, we are back to the singular number, he arrived. This shows the translator was clearly basing his translation on the Avestan, not the Pahlavi. And we can take it one step further by showing that the grammatical form that is used in the Avestan, if to give it a technical pass, we could say, it is a third singular present injunctive or potentially an imperfect active form. And exactly the same grammatical form, a third singular imperfect active, is then used in the Sanskrit. The second example concerns a phenomenon known as Tinesis. This is where a word or a phrase is broken up and we have other words intervening. For example, in English you could say, fan-frickin-tastic. Okay, where fantastic is broken up, we have something in the middle. And we find this happening a lot in the Avestan text, particularly with divine names. Here is a line from Yasna 33, stanza 2. And I give the Avestan, Pahlavi and Sanskrit renderings. Here you can see the name Ahura Mazda is separated. We have a form, Zaushe, coming in between. In Pahlavi, the name Ahura Mazda became, even before Pahlavi, in fact, we can see it in Old Persian, the name became univerbated. What this means is the two elements became joined together and they were inseparable. So whereas in the Avesten we have two elements, Ahura and Mazda, in the Pahlavi we have just one, or Mazd. When we look at the Sanskrit translation, however, we can see that each of these two elements, Ahura and Mazda, have been translated separately. Ahura, meaning Lord, is translated by Svamin, and Mazda, translated by Mahajnanin, the Great Wise One. And you'll see an attempt has been made in the Sanskrit to mirror this Tinesis from the Avesten. So Ahura corresponding to Svamin, Mazda to Mahajnanin. Sometimes the order of these two elements, Ahura and Mazda, are reversed. And so what we find in the texts is instead Mazda, Ahura. Again, if we look at Yasna 31:21, we can see the two elements of the name are separated. We have a form in between. In Pahlavi, there's no way of representing this. Mazda, Ahura, this is all Mazd. But in the Sanskrit version, we can see a concerted effort has been made, again to reflect the order of the Avesten. So when the two elements, Ahura, Mazda, are reversed, Mazda, Ahura, this same reversal in the order of terms is reflected in the Sanskrit. Just one more example, the name Vohumana, good mind. Here you can see the two elements of the name are separated. In Pahlavi, Vohumana, like Ahura Mazda, has become one element, Wahman. But in the Sanskrit, they translate each of the Avesten names separately. Vohu, meaning good, translated with Uttama, best, and Mana, mind, translated by Sanskrit, Mana, mind. And we can see, paralleling the Avesten, the two elements are separated with an intervening form. The third way in which we can see the Sanskrit translators we're keeping one eye on the Avesten is through looking at what they did with all these little comments and exegeses that we find in the Pahlavi version of the text. I'm going to show you something. Don't freak out. It doesn't matter what it all means, but I hope to represent it through colours. So, Yasna 32:16. Here is a line of Avesten text. I put it in blue. Here's the corresponding Pahlavi version. The text in the Pahlavi, in blue, corresponds directly to the Avesten. This is the sort of direct translation. But you'll notice, between all these bits of translated text, we have lots of other comments coming in between, shown in different colours. And this is the way the Pahlavi text operates. It'll take an Avesten phrase, and then after a few words, it will insert a little comment to explain the meaning of the Avesten. And these comments and the translated text are sort of intertwined. When we come now to look at the corresponding Sanskrit text, if you can see by the colours, the Sanskrit translator has pieced together all the Pahlavi text that corresponds directly to the Avesten. So we have an unbroken line of text corresponding to the Avesten. And he's taken all the little comments and glosses from the Pahlavi text and put them after the translated text. And so in this way, the Sanskrit version of the text comes to resemble more the Avesten than the Pahlavi. This shows a very sophisticated working on behalf of these Sanskrit priests who are making the translations. The Sanskrit translators, however, were not just content to translate the comments, the explanations from the Pahlavi. They wanted to insert their own. Why not? So, from Yasna 115, here is a little Avesten phrase, Dharmoish upamanahe. The Pahlavi translation. And now the Sanskrit. The text in bold represents the direct translation of the Pahlavi and Avesten, but after it we have this long explanation all about curses, benedictions, those that are only repeated in the mind, those that are spoken out loud, which is the more powerful, etc., etc. And we find quite a number of these through the Sanskrit Yasna. Sometimes these very long explanations, which we don't find in the Pahlavi Yasna. And one really interesting task then is to try and trace these ideas contained in the Sanskrit Yasna, but not in the Pahlavi Yasna. Where do they come from? And in many cases we can actually identify corresponding passages in other Pahlavi texts. So there's one place in the Yasna, it's talking about the different fires. And then it gives in the Sanskrit version, a long explanation of all the different kinds of fires, etc., etc. And there is an exact parallel for this in the Bundehishan Pahlavi text. And so this affords us an insight into the exegetical tradition, how these priests were drawing on their knowledge and their understanding of Zoroastrian texts, not just the ones that they were working from, in order to explain the meaning behind, for example, the Yasna. Finally, I'd like to illustrate a couple of ways in which the Sanskrit Yasna reflects an attempt on the part of its translators to accommodate the Indian culture, the context in which it was being produced. So, for example, Yasna 42.3, we find in the Avesten mention of the peak of Mount Haraiti. The Pahlavi follows pretty closely the Avesten. And in the Sanskrit translation, however, we find at the end of its translation a little gloss, Meru. In Zoroastrian cosmography, the peak of the Mount Haraiti was believed to stand in the center of the earth. Corresponding to this idea of a central mountainous peak in Indian cosmographies, in Buddhist, Hindu, Jaina cosmographies, is also a mountain in the center of the earth, known not as the peak of Hara or Haraiti, but Mount Meru. And we can see the Sanskrit translator then adding a little comment at the end of his translation. He's saying, so, Hara, mountain, i.e. Meru, to make it somehow meaningful, presumably, for an Indian audience. Another example concerns the Sea of Wide Bays, the Zrayo Vorukasha. And in the Sanskrit version, again, at the end of its translation, we find a little gloss, Kshira Samudra. In Zoroastrian cosmography, the Sea of Wide Bays, at least a portion of it, was believed to encircle the central earth region of Khwaniratha. And in order to draw a little parallel with Indic cosmographic traditions, the translator makes mention of the sea of milk. And in Buddhist, Hindu, Jain cosmographies, encircling one of these earth regions was believed to be the Sea of Milk. And so this brings me now really to the conclusion. What I hope to have shown you is that far from being this barbarous text or this dull superimposition, the Sanskrit tradition has an awful lot to tell us about how the Zoroastrians, when they're finding themselves in a changed cultural and temporal context, how they were then interpreting their religion in light of all these changes, what it meant for them. And the Sanskrit texts then really give us a unique insight into these changes. And I hope, through my work, I can show the worth of these translations and hopefully stimulate greater interest going forward. Thank you very much.
Scholarly piece of comparative work, and it shows just how much time you must spend trawling through manuscripts to make all these comparisons. It's very, very interesting. So now that we've seen the sort of work you could be doing if you're that way inclined and a linguist of competence that Leon is, I throw the floor open to any questions that anyone would like to ask. I can see a question over here, so a lady who is a Hindu and a Sanskrit specialist will have something to offer us.
Well, I congratulate you doing this Rosetta Stone thing. That's very, very imaginative. I wanted to know just a bit about the name of the script, because this is Devanagari. And is that Semitic or is it Greek?
Well, the script in which is written the Sanskrit translation. Is that?
No, both.
Oh.
Avestan as well.
Oh, well.
Greek and as well as Semitic, the Shem looks like the Shem.
Right, so the script in which the Avesten is written and the Pahlavi is written is unrelated to the Nagari or Devanagari scripts in India. And so the Avestan and Pahlavi scripts run from right to left, as you have in Semitic scripts, but the Devanagari, the Sanskrit, runs left to right. And so, perhaps if I can show you, in order to get around this problem, they wrote the Sanskrit upside down relative to the Pahlavi and Avesten. So here is upside down the Pahlavi, but the right way up is the Sanskrit. Yeah? So they would turn the page upside down, and in this way they could achieve a sort of a continuity of line rather than having them clashing, because they run in different directions.
Was it a Hebrew script that they were using?
Not Hebrew per se, but yes, we see a development from Aramaic and Semitic scripts.
My question is not just about translation of the scriptures that you have mentioned, but translation of our prayer book. Why is it that no scholar has yet made our prayer book in a language that we can all understand? The same row is still, the script may be in English or Gujarat, but this is still in an ancient language, and 99% of us are not with PhDs. And isn't it high time that scholars like you are commissioned by elders like Warren Wright and others to write a prayer book that our children and others, and ourselves included, can understand when we pray?
I think part of our problem is that we can't agree what any of it means either. So I agree. When one reads some of these translations, particularly of the Gathas, for example, which are incredibly difficult to understand, the translations are as obscure and hard to understand as the Avesten itself. Hopefully, very shortly, my book on the Russian Yasht, the translation of the text, will be coming out. It's with the publisher at the moment, so hopefully very shortly. And there... And as we have gained a greater understanding of these manuscripts and the tradition, transmission, we can begin to make accessible translations of these texts.